Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Brandon Till. I'm the head of business solutions here at Soldo, here to unpack the latest edition of the Spending Index. Happily to be joined by Natasha Prag, the author of the Spend Index. Natasha, maybe tell us a little bit about you.
Hi, thanks, Brandon. I am senior content writer at Soldo and the report author. And the report itself is based on data from over 25,000 Soldo companies and across 7 European markets. And it looks at spending data from Q1 2024 to Q4 2025. So it's year on year with some look backs in terms of quarter as well. What's interesting, I think, is the insight reflects those real world transactions. So we look at key categories, segment by market, location, business size, and industries where relevant.
I was pleased to get it. I dug into it yesterday. It was just released yesterday. It's actually been downloaded over 1,000 times from our website already. You know, it's interesting data because it strikes me that this is real spend data from companies, and it's telling us some things that surveys never could by looking at how companies have actually spent. So I guess before we get into the detail, what would be one thing that surprised you coming out of the Spend Index?
So the report looks at 4 areas. So we look at T&E, we look at AI, we look at operational spending, so day-to-day spending, and recurring / departmental spending. And I think while we saw sort of a decline in a couple of markets and categories, overall, the report really paints a quite bullish business spend environment. And I think what surprised me most was the pace of that change, which has been, exponential, really. As we discuss the data a bit more, the markets and the industries that are driving this growth and investment are quite unexpected. So yeah, it's very much the pace of growth, I think, struck me as most interesting.
Well, I was going to say similar. I agree, because I think we looked at the start of the year and every sign was saying it's going to be a conservative year and it might be a hard economy. And we didn't expect to come to the end of the year and see the actual way companies acted, the actual way companies were spending was quite different than at least what we would have anticipated for last year. The economy keeps moving, things keep humming along. And so, I do want to unpack all of the categories that you mentioned. We'll have a chance to dive into them all in a little more detail and really look at, I think, the overall picture of that shifting from cost cutting to cost optimization, that spending becoming more and more decentralized across different teams that I thought came through, and just the rising expectations around control and the speed teams need for reporting. I think all of this comes through as some of the themes we can touch on today. Maybe we can start with T&E spend. T&E spend, I had a time in my career, I worked for Kayak and I thought a lot about T&E, working for one of the big travel search engines. And what we saw in the report was T&E spend rebounding, like really getting to points, pre-pandemic levels. That seems like such a thing of the past, but we're really past where we were. Why do you think that T&E rebounded so strongly, and especially rebounded in some markets, but not other markets? What's your take on this?
Sure. So I think what the data kind of shows us is that T&E didn't rebound evenly. And I think that is a reflection of the work itself, which work isn't distributed evenly. So, for example, markets like Italy, where the average T&E spend rose by 26%, that saw a much stronger rebound because of a number of factors, right? So higher reliance on in-person events, a greater sector mix, faster return to travel-heavy work, such as client meetings, site visits, events, for example. Whereas in the UK, it only grew by 12%. And I think that reflects a kind of more cautious approach and that kind of tempering the pace of travel recovery. Looking also back at the data, by company size, it also plays a role. So smaller companies drove much of that overall growth, which actually increased T&E by 19%. So that kind of suggests that agility is really important, with smaller teams being able to kind of decide faster and travel when needed. And I think that really plays an important role on overall business growth. And for me, I think the takeaway here is that T&E reflects how work happens locally, right? So it's shaped by those industries, geography, company size, culture, but not necessarily a budget policy. And what we find is that a number of businesses employ a one size fits all, which doesn't always reflect the nature of work, as you've probably seen.
Yeah, I was just thinking that one, the advantage of this type of data set is that we are able to segment so specifically, whether it's per country or company size, and you do get sort of a different story of how businesses are behaving and whether that affects a company's go to market or how they might, behave depending on what their services are, I think it can provide some insight. And I think then zooming back into the macro, yeah, what you mentioned travel policies and this one size fits all. Looking at it as a whole, we see how this views. Well, what would you say that means for this one size fits all? Is there a one size fits all travel policy that then would fit different businesses?
No, I don't think so. And especially, I think when you have a one size fits all and those rigid rules, it starts to create friction and bottlenecks within business, which slow businesses down. And in a market, with rising costs and greater supply chain issues, actually, that's the opposite. You need to be faster. You need to be quicker to be able to make changes, to be able to travel. And I think it needs to be able to flex, right? So
Right.
where people are based is important. The role that they perform, even by seasonality, that's a really important factor that needs to come into play when looking at policies.
It reminds me, I worked at a company years ago, and the finance team thought, oh, T&E is a bit out of control. This is an area where we're going to be able to save. So they really tightened up the T&E policy. It didn't actually curb spending. In the end, what it did is create a lot more requests for out of policy requests. And they created a lot more managers now just approving en masse. Yeah, okay, that's okay for this. That's okay for this. So it ended up just creating more out of policy spend and more managers spending time approving. What they thought would control actually had quite the opposite effect. It just created less productivity, and it created really little to no savings in the T&E policy in the end. So how would you say, how should finance teams then balance this flexibility for teams if there's rising costs or pressure? What would be the advice?
So a few things really. Being able to create wallets and ring fencing certain costs so that people can spend when they need. It's also creating a much more flat system. So allowing people to spend when they need to, but being able to have complete visibility of that spend. So you know exactly what's being spent, where it's being spent, and how, which is something that Soldo does fantastically well.
I'd say
That,
as a solo employee, just the knowledge, just being able to see the expense policies where you're doing the spending is an advantage. I think back to people I've worked with. I know one who would intentionally book out of policy. One person out of the thousands of people I've worked with in the past. So it does happen.
Yeah.
But typically what I found is if people are booking not within the policy, it's more of a they didn't know more than they're trying to get away with something. And so I think the idea of how do you make that knowledgeable, how do you help really make it automatic or easy for people to book in policy, they're likely to do it.
What's also interesting, you mentioned about employees spending their own money very briefly, and we recently released a number of reports, one specifically looking at kind of one productivity, but two looking at how employees feel about spending their own money, so spending out of pocket, and actually the impact of spending their own money. And I mean, the ramifications were all, as you can imagine, fairly negative. So employees felt disgruntled. They also suffered from sort of anxiety around having to spend their money and not knowing when they would be reimbursed. And I think from a productivity perspective, if we're looking at it from business, it's businesses need employees to be productive. And if that is directly hampering productivity, then there's an issue. So actually looking at a way to be able to control it from a proactive perspective is even more important.
Yeah. Absolutely. I want to shift gears a little bit to everyone's favorite hot topic of the moment, but it's AI, which, we started doing this report a few years ago. And I think at that time it was who's using AI. Then it switched to kind of how are teams using AI. And now it's almost how are you not using AI, becoming so commonplace. And I think there's some really interesting reflections that came out of this report as well. Largely, I think if you look at almost sort of some specialist AI tools, what's the balance here? How does this tell us the data that we see in the report? How does it tell us about how teams are actually using AI today?
I think there's been so much hype recently, and from the data, I mean, that's completely reflected. So we've seen a really sharp growth in very specialist AI tools. So tools that sort of perform native coding, app building platforms. And it kind of suggests that people are beyond this kind of experimentation phase, and they're really looking at tools that can expedite what they're doing and create value. And they're using it very specifically. So they're writing code, they're building workflows, they are analyzing data and automating tasks. And we can see that when we look at the data. For example, Cursor, that's up 994%, and Anthropic, which is up 489%. And this kind of spend is very rarely kind of top down, right? It starts kind of with teams finding tools that help them do their jobs, and then they adopt them really, really quickly. And I think that's really important for finance and procurement to recognize. because it's, as they're becoming more embedded day to day, it's actually having the oversight and the knowledge of these tools joining the tech stack and also becoming its own sort of cost center. And I think with that, the implication is that kind of governance can't sit outside of that behavior. It has to do the opposite, which is support. You have to support the employees to be able to
Right.
use AI.
Right. No, that makes sense. I think I like you bring up procurement. I think procurement, aside from supporting the employees, it's one of those that need to be advocating for themselves, that otherwise willing to continue on with some processes that could desperately use something like whether it's AI or just automations to increase the workflows and teams that are vital to the business, but perhaps a little time poor in terms of how do they support and how do they keep up with their workload. So it's interesting to see. And one thing I found was really interesting that stood out to me as I read through was, we work in tech and it's like, oh, we've been using it in different ways for a while, but to see some of the more traditional businesses and seeing about how AI is getting used more across industries. Can you unpack that for a little bit? How are traditional sectors using AI today?
Of course. And I think it's almost a case of catching up, right? They finally made it. They're sort of the more traditional sectors that often move, quite cautiously at first. I mean, there are lots of reasons for that. Regulation, for example, so tightening regulation, the operational complexity, risk exposure, and I think that can really impact ability to move quicker. But I think once the value is clear, the acceleration could be much quicker. And so we're talking some financial services, public sector, manufacturing and construction, also sort of a 400 plus increase in uptake, which is enormous spend. And I think for these sectors, they're finally kind of recognizing and really embedding AI into their workflows. But again, it kind of goes back to that kind of governance, and that especially in these sorts of, more cautious, slower moving industries, they can't afford to have ambiguity around data and accountability. And I think that's going to continue to be a theme over the next few years in terms of risk, especially, as you've probably read and seen.
Completely. It's, I don't think employees will stop demanding more tools or ways that are going to remove friction from their day to day, but it does create, if governance can't keep up, as you mentioned, where do you see that? Where do you see the biggest risk coming in? When AI spend and this is growing faster than governance can keep up.
I think two things here. One, it's the training. The pace of training hasn't kept up with the pace of implementation of AI tools. We know this. We can go out quickly in Google and you'll see, lots of documents, lots of blog posts and reports saying that employees would like more training on AI. But it also means that employees aren't using it to their best of their abilities. And so that in itself is a productivity issue. But beyond this, without sort of guidance, best practice, for example, it becomes a risk. And so people are using it in a way that could be seen as risky, with more kind of inconsistent outcomes, and then that's sort of the added exposure. And I think what's really important here for businesses is that they need to pair that autonomy in AI with structure and giving, that's guidance and visibility into AI, but its usage as well. And I think employees need to be supported in their use of it, which is, very important.
Yeah, it is a great balancing act, as some of these tools and technologies is moving faster than the business can keep up. I think training is a great point. And I'm sure, I would guess a majority of those tools out there probably aren't being used to their full extent, whether it's, lack of skill, lack of knowledge. So it's definitely a good point of how do we also support not just the buying of tools, but the capability for teams to use them. I think it goes down to as well. I could see a trend coming with AI, the same thing we saw in SaaS for many years, which is, are there licenses, are there tools now sitting there unused? Something that was useful at one time that's not, or empty seats within a tool teams are paying for. So making sure finance teams especially, can also keep up with that they're not, they want to be investing in tools that are useful, but not unused, which also a bit takes us to the next form of spend, which is operational spend and recurring spend, looking to shine a light on how how is this changing within business? But thinking of operational spend, it can get overlooked until month end. What's the report say on this? The need for this operational spend, and how does the governance fit in?
So if we look at the spend data, about 63% of it is made up of operational spend. So that is pretty much the majority of spending on Soldo. And so that's a huge amount. And actually year on year, this is up 16%. So again, it's growing very, very fast. And I think what's interesting about this is while it's such a large number, operation spend doesn't really feel very risky when you're spending. Quite often it's kind of small, frequent spend, again, widely distributed across lots of teams. And I think because that spend is so fragmented, it doesn't feel risky and it doesn't really feel of much concern. But it's only once you start compounding and you start looking at it, taking a step back and you sort of look at it from, at month end, you start realizing that actually it's a great deal of money. And I think the traditional finance kind of processes, they're often built to review spend in batches, right? So at your month end, but that's after it's happened. And I think that can work for larger, more infrequent purchases, but for day-to-day purchases that keep the business running, it doesn't feel like it works. And so for businesses, I think it needs to be, you need reactive processes. So sorry, that should be proactive processes, because it's the reactive ones are just far too late. That's when you realize that money has been spent already. So
yeah, I'd say part of that too, as you're operating in within a month is, months in the spring aren't always the same as months in the summer and always the same as months in the fall. And to be able to be proactive with it is, what budgets do you have to play around with? What budgets can you move? Who's underspent? Who's overspent? Especially, you get down to Q4 and you might have budget that's available if you have the view of it, especially think operationally, and certain things need to keep going, but some things are more expensive and some things weren't. So just being able to understand what budget is available to you that you could be proactive with. I come back to subscriptions where, it's this recurring spend that can quickly get away with you and it quickly stacks up. I agree with you. It feels very not hard, feels very safe in the moment where you're purchasing this one small tool, but those quickly start to add up, especially if all of a sudden ownership becomes unclear. So, what's the problem with this recurring spend regarding ownership, and how might you smooth that out?
So I think you touched on it earlier in terms of those duplicates of subscriptions. And so they do creep in across teams because there isn't enough communication and there isn't somebody sort of joining the dots. And that means that renewals happen, but the person who bought the subscription has now left the business, and so it's hard to keep track of. And so much of this ends up being a manual process, and it's only then highlighted at the end of the month when finance actually sees the cost, but without context. And so they're left chasing at month end instead of spending that time doing other things, which then creates tension because it's not in fact wouldn't want to be doing that for days, having to chase receipts and try to gain understanding. And to me, it kind of feels like a blocker to progress.
Right. So how would you balance this? What would good control look like in this case, especially if subscriptions or recurring spend, without making people drown in admin or making sure we can access what they would need to do their work? What does good control look like without burying people in admin?
It means good control. To me, means fewer surprises. Especially sort of around month end, it is a kind of no surprises environment. But it also means not greater control in the sense that you want it to be flat and we want approvals pre-baked into how we pay. So in that sense, we want it to be proactive. So we want to be able to set budgets and have them adhered to. And it means that clarity in our payments, it creates confidence and it allows us to kind of scale as well. And I think for finance, I think for procurement as well, to stay close to what is happening without kind of the hassle of chasing receipts and approvals. And that's kind of the biggest difference.
Yeah, it is. It reminds me, I worked for a company growing very fast, and I was in the product marketing team at the time. And they, we had a survey tool. We're doing lots of surveys to customers and things. We had the pro license, and then after a few years of using this and wishing we had enterprise, we realized the product team has the enterprise license of this exact same tool. And we could have been, had we had aligned budgets, we could have all been want to save the company a lot of money and had better features and better access to it. And it's that mix of would have been better ourselves had we had known or had this communication or a tool that would have given us that visibility, or finance or someone that visibility to say, how are we spending and is it being used well? I guess the control with that departmental freedom. And I also wanted to bring this one up because it leads us into that departmental spend. And at what point do subscriptions stop being, start being more operational to the business, stop being discretionary in terms of departmental spend?
I think it happens when it stops sort of being a trial and it becomes an essential part of work. And it's essential to what that team does. And that's something I think with recurring spend, it's just very persistent and budgets sort of fluctuate quite quickly, but those sort of subscriptions tend to stay, and teams really rely on them to function, to get their day-to-day work done. So I think that's really, really important. And I think with departmental spend, so it's increased year on year by 22%. And quite interestingly, small companies led that growth, with marketing specific department spend growing in pretty much every market, which is really, really interesting. The marketing spend grew uh, 48 by 48 million euros, which is an enormous amount. And what's also really interesting is that the biggest increases were France, 33%, Italy, 29%, and the Netherlands at 24%. Interestingly, also Spain decreased by 39%. So it's quite interesting to see the fluctuations, as we've written Spend Index for several years now, and it is pretty much one of the greatest fluctuating. So it'll be really interesting to see where marketing spend lands by the end of the year, and into the next year. And my personal opinion that it's going to increase. So it'll be interesting to see.
I suppose at the last year again, we thought this would be a conservative economy, and it turned out to be more bullish. And so, one of those things that it's great when we can see, like in this report, you can see the year over year, quarter over quarter for a couple of years, and really start to see clear trends in some of these categories. I found really interesting. And with this departmental spend too, it raises the question for me then of where does it break down? Is it finance or procurement? Is it through the purchase? Is it the renewal? Is it just in the usage? Where's the breakdown happening within this? And
I think it's sort of lost at the kind of the renewal stage, and it's reflective, I think, almost of a kind of lack of kind of control, visibility, and ownership. And also the kind of renewals often sit kind of in the middle, owned by no one, and then they automatically renew and they repeat, and nobody really is in charge of that specific tool, apart from sort of finance and procurement being the only ones who can see that cost, but not necessarily knowing what they're for. And again, that's kind of where the tension then sort of creeps in and stops employees from being able to do their jobs. And I think having that clear ownership is really important, and also shared visibility into those renewals is extremely important, which Soldo does very well. It allows you to see what's being spent where, by whom. And it's almost autonomous in its fashion, but it allows employees to be able to spend, but gives them the control to spend properly.
yeah, I think visibility is such key, and I think it's like you saying who spent what where, but also what are you spent versus budget? What have you spent versus what you agreed to spend, to figure out? Don't have to wait till month end or the quarter close to try to say where are we at, and understand how the business is performing. You can make many more decisions throughout the year when you have that knowledge. Well, I do want to wrap it up. It's been interesting to hear about our operational spend, department spend, T&E spend, and of course AI. So just want some overall trends and your thoughts then, based on this report and the data we've seen for a lot of finance leaders probably already reading this report or joining us on this webinar. If they could focus on one area this year, where would you say a finance leader should focus?
I would say visibility. But I know I've spoken about it already throughout this webinar, but it's not having more reports, it's not more control, it's just having a very clear real-time view of what's being spent by who, why, and kind of as it happens. And our data overwhelmingly shows that spend is becoming increasingly decentralized and widely distributed. So this also means that finance just cannot realistically kind of review and approve everything. It's impossible. And by even attempting to do this, it kind of creates bottlenecks and frustration for both employees and for finance. And so I think recognizing this as a fact, and then creating ways to kind of work to lessen this as a problem. So creating clear kind of rules, setting limits by role, team, and policies that automatically enforce really help. And again, I think visibility over everything, over spend, will really be the number one area, I think, for finance teams and procurement teams.
Yeah, I agree. This it's not slowing down, right? Employees are not being asked to do less. There's not more skilled, especially within finance, entering the workforce. So to me, it's about taking some inventory. Finance teams chance to take a look around and figure out what is slowing you down, what's making it that you're not really achieving what you could be as that team towards the business. Take some inventory. Where's the biggest bottlenecks that you could start removing, whether it's AI or whether it's just automating some of these outdated process, to take a fresh look at them, because the decentralized nature of spend and the decentralized workforce, it's going to continue, which puts more and more strain on these systems and on these people. It's been incredibly interesting to hear this. Where can people, if they want to dig in more, they want to see all these stats that you've been mentioning, where can we get this ourselves?
I think you should be able to download the report. You're able to download it through the webinar, but it's also available on the website in our guide section.
We'll make sure we make it visible. We'll share it here. Ultimately, though, businesses that are going to win, you can look at this data, see where the trends are, see where things are going. And I think the teams that will win, the finance teams, the businesses that are going to win in 2026 will be the ones that can help take control of their spending, and also the ones who help the teams and the other teams take control of their workload. Take the finance work out of them and let them achieve their more. Like we said, we liberate finance, we free things up so that everyone can accomplish more. So thank you all for spending time with us. Again, I'm Brandon Till from Soldo, joined by Natasha. Thank you so much.
Thank you.